The unconscious roots of betrayal, Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic framework, offers a provocative lens through which to explore the concept of betrayal, particularly as it pertains to women, a theme he addressed with both insight and controversy. At the heart of his theory lies the unconscious mind, a vast hidden reservoir of desires, fears, and conflicts that shape human behavior in ways we rarely perceive directly. In the context of female betrayal, Freud argued that women's actions in relationships, particularly those perceived as disloyal or deceptive, often stem from unresolved tensions rooted in early developmental stages, most notably the Oedipal complex. This chapter delves into Freud's interpretation of these unconscious roots, examining how his ideas illuminate the notion of betrayal while acknowledging the limitations and criticisms of his gender-specific claims. Freud's concept of the Oedipal complex, developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is central to his understanding of psychological development. For girls, this stage involves a complex interplay of attachment and rivalry. According to Freud, a young girl initially forms a strong emotional bond with her mother, but as she becomes aware of gender differences, her desires shift toward her father, whom she perceives as a figure of power and affection. This shift creates a sense of rivalry with the mother, who becomes both a competitor and a model for identification. Freud posited that unresolved feelings from this phase, whether unfulfilled desires for the father or lingering resentment toward the mother, persist in the unconscious, influencing adult relationships. In the context of betrayal, Freud suggested that women might unconsciously reenact these early conflicts, projecting feelings of rejection or inadequacy onto romantic partners, leading to behaviors that could be interpreted as disloyalty. For Freud, betrayal was not necessarily a conscious act but a manifestation of repressed emotions. A woman might, for instance, sabotage a relationship or act in ways that undermine trust, driven by unconscious needs to resolve or repeat the emotional dynamics of her childhood. These actions could take the form of infidelity, emotional withdrawal, or even subtle manipulations, all of which Freud tied to the unresolved Oedipal struggle. He argued that the girl's recognition of her lack of a penis, central to his controversial theory of penis envy, further complicates her relational dynamics, fostering a sense of inferiority that might manifest as resentment or betrayal toward men, who symbolize the power she feels deprived of. This dynamic, Freud claimed, could lead women to unconsciously undermine male partners as a way of reclaiming agency or expressing unresolved anger. However, Freud's theories are not without significant critique, particularly from modern feminist scholars who argue that his views are steeped in the patriarchal assumptions of his time. Critics like Karen Horney and Simone de Beauvoir have challenged the notion that women's psychology is inherently tied to biological lack, or Oedipal rivalry, pointing instead to societal structures that enforce gender inequality. Horney, for instance, proposed that what Freud interpreted as penis envy might better be understood as envy of male social privilege, a response to cultural restrictions rather than an innate psychological defect. This perspective reframes betrayal not as a product of unconscious childhood conflicts, but as a reaction to external pressures, such as societal expectations that limit women's autonomy. A woman's betrayal in a relationship, then, might reflect resistance to oppressive norms rather than an inherent psychological flaw. Despite these criticisms, Freud's emphasis on the unconscious offers a compelling framework for understanding how past experiences shape present behavior. His case studies, such as that of Dora, a young woman whose supposed hysteria Freud linked to repressed sexual desires and familial conflicts, illustrate his belief that betrayal often stems from unconscious motivations. In Dora's case, Freud interpreted her rejection of male suitors and her emotional volatility as expressions of unresolved Oedipal desires, redirected toward inappropriate targets. While modern psychology might interpret Dora's behavior as a response to trauma or societal pressure, Freud's analysis highlights the enduring influence of early relationships on adult emotional life. Ultimately, Freud's analysis of female betrayal, while groundbreaking for its time, is both illuminating and flawed. His emphasis on the unconscious and early developmental stages offers a rich framework for understanding how past experiences shape relational dynamics. However, his gender-specific theories, particularly the Oedipal complex and penis envy, have been widely criticized for their reductive and patriarchal assumptions. Modern psychology, informed by feminist critiques and advances in neuroscience, suggests that betrayal is not a uniquely female phenomenon but a human one, driven by a complex interplay of biology, psychology, and culture. By revisiting Freud's ideas through a contemporary lens, we can appreciate his insights into the unconscious, while recognizing the need to move beyond his limitations to understand betrayal in all its nuance. Penis envy and the myth of Lack Sigmund. Freud's concept of penis envy, one of his most controversial and widely debated theories, lies at the heart of his explanation for what he perceived as female betrayal in relationships. Introduced as part of his psychoanalytic framework in the early 20th century, penis envy posits that young girls, upon discovering anatomical differences between sexes, experience a profound sense of lack or inferiority due to their absence of a penis. Freud argued that this perceived deficiency shapes women's psychological development, fostering unconscious resentment toward men, who are seen as possessing the power and privilege associated with maleness. In the context of betrayal, Freud suggested that this resentment could manifest as behaviors that undermine trust or loyalty in relationships, such as emotional manipulation or infidelity, as women unconsciously seek to compensate for or rebel against their perceived inferiority. This chapter explores the intricacies of Freud's theory, its implications for understanding female betrayal, and the significant criticisms that challenge its validity, particularly from feminist and modern psychological perspectives. Freud's theory of penis envy emerges from his broader model of psychosexual development, which outlines stages through which children progress as they mature. For girls, the phallic stage, roughly ages 3 to 6, is pivotal, as it is during this period that they become aware of anatomical differences. According to Freud, a girl's realization that she lacks a penis leads to a sense of castration anxiety, not in the literal sense experienced by boys, but as a symbolic loss. This perceived lack, Freud argued, triggers envy of the male organ and, by extension, the social and psychological power it represents in a patriarchal society. He posited that this envy becomes a driving force in female psychology, influencing women's relationships with men and their sense of self. In the context of betrayal, Freud suggested that women might unconsciously act against male partners through deceit, emotional withdrawal, or relational sabotage as a way to reclaim power or express anger rooted in this early sense of deficiency. For Freud, penis envy was not merely a fleeting childhood phase but a persistent force in the unconscious, shaping women's relational dynamics into adulthood. He argued that women's desire to possess the penis could manifest symbolically, such as through the pursuit of male partners who embody power, or through motherhood, where bearing a male child might serve as a substitute for the lacked organ. However, when these desires remain unfulfilled or repressed, Freud believed they could lead to feelings of resentment or hostility toward men, whom women perceive as withholding the power they crave. This resentment, he suggested, might express itself as betrayal, acts that undermine the trust or stability of a relationship, driven by an unconscious need to assert agency or retaliate against perceived male dominance. For example, Freud might interpret a woman's infidelity as an unconscious attempt to steal male power or to punish a partner for embodying the privilege she feels denied. The concept of penis envy has been heavily criticized, particularly by feminist scholars who argue that it reflects the patriarchal biases of Freud's era. Critics like Karen Horney, a contemporary of Freud, challenge the idea that women's psychology is defined by a sense of biological inferiority. Horney proposed that what Freud called penis envy was more accurately power envy, a response to the social privileges afforded to men in a male-dominated society. In conclusion, Freud's concept of penis envy offers a provocative but deeply flawed explanation for female betrayal. By framing women's psychology as rooted in a sense of lack, Freud provided a framework for understanding unconscious resentment, but failed to account for the social and cultural forces that shape behavior. Feminist critiques and modern psychological research offer a more nuanced view, suggesting that betrayal is not a uniquely female phenomenon but a human one, driven by a complex interplay of personal, social, and historical factors. While Freud's ideas remain influential for their focus on the unconscious, they must be reinterpreted through a contemporary lens to fully understand the dynamics of betrayal in relationships. The hysteria hypothesis. Sigmund Freud's concept of hysteria, a cornerstone of his early psychoanalytic work, provides another lens through which he explored behaviors he associated with female betrayal. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hysteria was a widely diagnosed condition, primarily among women, characterized by symptoms such as emotional volatility, physical ailments without clear medical causes, and behaviors that defied social norms. Freud linked these symptoms to repressed sexual desires and unresolved unconscious conflicts, arguing that women exhibiting hysterical behaviors, such as emotional outbursts, relational disloyalty, or defiance of male authority, were acting out internal struggles rooted in their psychosexual development. In the context of betrayal, Freud's hysteria hypothesis suggests that such behaviors reflect unconscious attempts to express or resolve repressed desires, often manifesting as actions that undermine trust in relationships. This chapter examines Freud's theory of hysteria, its implications for understanding female betrayal, and the significant criticisms that highlight its oversimplifications and cultural biases. Freud's understanding of hysteria evolved from his early work with patients like Anna O., whose case, studied under his mentor Joseph Breuer, became a foundational moment in psychoanalysis. Anna O. exhibited symptoms such as paralysis, speech difficulties, and emotional distress, which Freud and Breuer attributed to repressed emotions tied to traumatic experiences. Freud later expanded this idea, arguing that hysteria stemmed from repressed sexual desires, particularly those emerging during the phallic stage of psychosexual development. For women, he suggested, these desires were often linked to the Oedipal complex, where unresolved feelings for the father or rivalry with the mother created internal conflicts. When these conflicts were repressed, pushed into the unconscious due to their socially unacceptable nature, they could resurface as hysterical symptoms, including behaviors that appeared as betrayal, such as emotional manipulation, infidelity, or rejection of a partner's authority. In Freud's view, hysteria was a gendered phenomenon, disproportionately diagnosed in women due to their supposed susceptibility to emotional and sexual repression. He argued that women's socialization in Victorian society, which demanded chastity and passivity, forced them to suppress their libidinal drives, leading to psychological distress. This distress could manifest in ways that disrupted relationships, such as sudden emotional outbursts or acts of defiance that partners might perceive as betrayal. For example, a woman who abruptly withdrew affection or accused her partner of wrongdoing might, in Freud's analysis, be expressing unconscious conflicts rather than deliberate disloyalty. He saw these behaviors as symbolic, reflecting deeper struggles with repressed desires or unresolved Oedipal tensions, often tied to the perceived lack of a penis, as discussed in Chapter 2. Freud's case studies, particularly that of Dora, illustrate how he applied the hysteria hypothesis to behaviors he interpreted as betrayal. Dora, an 18-year-old patient, displayed symptoms such as coughing fits, depression, and resistance to male authority figures, including her father and a family friend who made unwanted advances. Freud interpreted these symptoms as hysterical, stemming from repressed sexual desires and conflicts within her family. Her refusal to accept the advances of the family friend, whom Freud believed she unconsciously desired, was seen as a form of relational betrayal, not only of the man, but of the social expectations that she comply with male authority. Freud argued that Dora's symptoms and behaviors were expressions of her unconscious struggle to reconcile her desires with societal norms, resulting in actions that disrupted trust and harmony in her relationships. However, Freud's hysteria hypothesis has been widely criticized for its oversimplification and patriarchal biases. Feminist scholars, such as Elaine Showalter, have argued that hysteria was less a psychological condition and more a cultural construct, used to pathologize women who deviated from Victorian gender norms. In Freud's era, women were expected to be submissive and emotionally restrained. Those who expressed anger, sexuality, or independence were often labeled hysterical and institutionalized. From this perspective, behaviors Freud interpreted as betrayal might be better understood as acts of resistance against oppressive social structures. A woman's emotional outbursts or refusal to conform to a partner's expectations could reflect a struggle for autonomy rather than an unconscious expression of repressed desires. This critique challenges Freud's assumption that hysteria, and, by extension, betrayal, is rooted in individual psychology rather than societal pressures. Modern psychology has largely abandoned the diagnosis of hysteria, recognizing it as a catch-all term that obscured a range of conditions, from anxiety disorders to trauma responses. Advances in neuroscience and clinical psychology suggest that symptoms once labeled hysterical, such as dissociation or somatic complaints, may stem from trauma, stress, or neurological factors rather than repressed sexual desires. For example, contemporary research on post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, shows that emotional volatility and relational difficulties can result from unresolved trauma, which Freud's framework did not adequately address. In the context of betrayal, this suggests that a woman's actions, such as withdrawing from a relationship or acting unpredictably, might reflect responses to external stressors or past experiences rather than unconscious conflicts tied to psychosexual development. Freud's cultural context heavily influenced his views on hysteria and betrayal. In Victorian Europe, women's roles were tightly constrained, and any deviation from the ideal of the angel in the house was seen as a threat to social order. Women who expressed strong emotions or challenged male authority were often deemed unstable, and hysteria became a convenient diagnosis to control and silence them. Freud's patients, many of whom were women navigating these restrictive norms, often described feelings of entrapment or frustration. He interpreted these as signs of internal conflict, but they likely also reflected the external realities of a patriarchal society. A woman's betrayal in this context, whether through emotional distance or defiance, might have been a subconscious rebellion against these constraints, rather than a manifestation of hysteria. Freud also drew on literary and mythological archetypes to support his hysteria hypothesis. Figures like Medea, who betrayed her husband Jason in Greek mythology, or the hysterical women in 19th century literature, reinforced cultural narratives of women as emotionally unstable and prone to betrayal. Freud saw these archetypes as reflecting universal psychological truths, but critics argue they perpetuated stereotypes that pathologized women's emotions. A woman's actions perceived as betrayal might instead be seen as attempts to assert agency in a world that demonized her for doing so. This interplay between psychology and culture underscores the complexity of interpreting behaviors through Freud's lens. Moreover, Freud's reliance on sexual repression as the root of hysteria has been challenged by modern theories of relational dynamics. Attachment theory, for instance, suggests that trust and loyalty in relationships are shaped by early interactions with caregivers, not necessarily sexual conflicts. A woman's behavior that appears as betrayal might stem from insecure attachment, patterns, or learned responses to relational stress rather than repressed libidinal drives. Similarly, social learning theory highlights how societal norms and gender roles shape behavior, suggesting that women's actions are often responses to external expectations rather than internal conflicts. Despite its limitations, Freud's hysteria hypothesis offers valuable insights into the unconscious drivers of behavior. His recognition that emotional distress can manifest in physical or relational symptoms was groundbreaking, paving the way for modern understandings of psychosomatic disorders and trauma. However, his gender-specific framing of hysteria as a primarily female condition reflects the biases of his time, ignoring the broader social and cultural factors that shaped women's experiences. In the context of betrayal, Freud's ideas suggest that unconscious conflicts can disrupt relationships, but they fail to account for the external pressures, such as patriarchal norms, that may drive such behaviors. Modern psychology offers a more nuanced view, recognizing betrayal as a human phenomenon influenced by a complex interplay of personal, social, and historical factors. In conclusion, Freud's hysteria hypothesis provides a provocative but flawed explanation for female betrayal. By linking behaviors like emotional volatility or relational disloyalty to repressed sexual desires, Freud highlighted the role of the unconscious in shaping behavior. However, his focus on hysteria as a gendered condition oversimplifies the complexities of human relationships and ignores the societal constraints that shaped women's lives. Feminist critiques and modern psychological research offer a more balanced perspective, suggesting that betrayal is not unique to women, but reflects broader human experiences of conflict, trauma, and resistance. Reinterpreting Freud's ideas through a contemporary lens allows us to appreciate his contributions while moving beyond his limitations, to understand betrayal in all its complexity.